In 1066, Harold Godwinson became King of England after the death of Edward the Confessor, but his right to rule did not go unchallenged. First, King Harald Hardrada of Norway landed in northeast England, near York. Despite initially gaining a foothold in the region, the army was finally defeated and Hardrada was killed in the battle at Stamford Bridge. But this wasn't the end of the new king's troubles. Before he got a chance to celebrate his victory, he was forced to march his army all the way back past London to face off against the second invader, as he received word that William, Duke of Normandy, had landed in Sussex. On the 13th of October, the Anglo-Saxon army set up on a hill near Hastings, close to the camp of the Norman invaders. The following morning, King Harold Godwinson formed his force into a formidable 7,000-strong shield wall. They faced off against 8,000 Norman soldiers who began the battle firing volleys of arrows up the hill. The English infantry were fierce, wielding two-handed battle axes cleaving through armour and shields of the invaders with ease. But William's army was quick, with 2,000 armoured cavalry able to charge up the hill and attack Harold head-on. Harold had initial success, and for a moment it seemed that he would be able to hold his position long enough to repel the attackers. Hearing a rumour that William had fallen in battle, some of his forces panicked and began to flee, and in a fatal error some of the Anglo-Saxon soldiers broke out of their impenetrable shield wall and began to pursue them down the hill. William the would-be conqueror removed his helmet, proving to his troops that he lived to fight on and lead them to victory, rallying his troops and annihilating the English giving chase. William renewed his assault on the shield wall, sometimes pretending to flee to see if he could repeat the pattern and lure Harold down the hill, but the line held. The Anglo-Saxons, desperate to hold the line, were packed so close that the dead men stayed standing and the wounded had nowhere to retreat. As daylight faded, there came a decisive moment in English history. William the Conqueror launched a final assault and an arrow whistled through the air, straight into the right eye of King Harold Godwinson of England, who fell to the ground, dead. The Anglo-Saxons, lacking leadership and any hope of success, finally broke lines and attempted to flee. They were pursued and cut down in their hundreds by William's cavalry. William the Conqueror was victorious. On Christmas Day 1066, William I was crowned King of England. The Anglo-Saxon reign in England was over, giving way to the era of the Normans. We start in 1328. Charles IV, King of France, died without an heir, leaving the question who should succeed him to the French crown. An assembly of nobles was left to make the decision between two obvious claimants. The first was Charles's cousin, Philip, Count of Valois. The second was Edward III, King of England and the late Charles's nephew. The fact they chose the native Frenchman rather than the English king will come as a shock to precisely nobody. Shortly after, a series of conflicts between England and France began, lasting over 100 years, and very cleverly named the 100 Years' War. Fast forward to the following century, in 1415 Henry V crossed the English Channel to begin an invasion of France, looking to pursue the very same claim to the French throne, inherited from his great-grandfather. Although he set sail with 12,000 soldiers, an unexpectedly long 6-week siege at Harfleur, injury and disease quickly saw his force diminished. Reluctant to return immediately back the way he came, wasting the fortune spent on the campaign, Henry chose to march his troops through France to Calais, to return to England that way. After repeatedly finding all routes across the River Somme blocked, he ran into a 20,000-strong French army near a small town. With just 6,000 ill and exhausted troops, the English army collided with the French at the Battle of Agincourt. Henry positioned his force next to a recently ploughed, muddy field surrounded by woodland. His men-at-arms formed the centre, flanked by 5,000 deadly accurate longbowmen, who could fire up to hundreds of thousands of arrows between them every single minute. Henry ordered his troops to advance slightly, goading the heavily armoured French cavalry to charge. Ironically, the weight of the heavy armour and horses proved deadly, as they quickly became stuck in the muddy, rain-soaked field. Meanwhile, volley after volley of arrows rained down, turning the battlefield into a complete bloodbath. Any knights who broke through to the English line were disorientated, tired, and quickly dispatched by the infantry with ease. Thousands of French knights, many of whom nobles, were killed, and even more were captured. Henry V emerged victorious, winning a marriage to the French King Charles VI's daughter and becoming heir to the French throne. Though this was not the end of the war, as unbeknown to him, he wouldn't live to claim his newly won crown. The Wars of the Roses were a bloody period in English history, fought between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. The Civil War was defined by murder, backstabbing and bloodshed. However, by 1483 it seemed like the worst was over, with Edward IV seizing the crown and living in peace for 12 years. But when he died, murder and treachery soon resumed, as his brother, Richard III, claimed the crown, imprisoning the rightful heir 12-year-old King Edward V and his even younger brother in the Tower of London, where they disappeared, never to be seen again. Rumours spread that Richard III had murdered his two nephews, and support again began to rise for the Lancastrians, led by Henry Tudor, to seize the throne. Henry Tudor set sail from Brittany and landed in South Wales. The Lancastrian army began marching east, growing in size until Henry Tudor approached Leicester with 5,000 men. Richard marched quickly to face them, fielding a Yorkist army of 10,000 soldiers. The main force of Richard's army was lined up on top of Ambion Hill. Lord Stanley and the Earl of Northumberland both had Yorkist forces that they kept separate from Richard's main host. The two armies collided, Richard's force charging down the hill and Henry's army upward. Richard had a much larger army, but Henry was able to withstand the first attack. As the battle raged on, the Wars of the Roses had yet another twist up their sleeves. Richard ordered the Earl of Northumberland to join him, knowing that their combined forces would likely have been enough to destroy the Lancastrians once and for all. But Northumberland refused, choosing to simply watch the outcome from afar. Lord Stanley did the same, and just like that, Richard's advantage seemed to vanish. Richard had remained on top of the hill overlooking the battle, and he noticed that Henry Tudor was in a weak position, surrounded by only a small rear guard left to protect him. Richard made the fatal decision to attempt to cripple the opposing army by cutting off its head, charging into the battle surrounded by heavy cavalry, heading straight for Henry's camp. Brave but foolish, Richard tried to kill Henry himself. Before he could, his horse was cut down from beneath him. Finally, Lord Stanley decided to mobilise his troops, but not to come to Richard's aid. Instead, he joined his force to Henry Tudor, encircling the king, who was finally cut down with a pike. In 1485, Richard III was the last English king to be killed on a battlefield. The battle was won. Henry VII had won the crown of England and married Elizabeth of York, ending the Wars of the Roses and starting the new Tudor dynasty. 160 years later, and England once again found itself caught in the turmoil of civil war. After years of clashes between Charles I and the English Parliament, a boiling point was reached in 1642. By 1645, it was not looking good for King Charles I. Charles still controlled the southwest, and Parliament had consistently failed to deliver the decisive blow that would end the war. This led to a decision to completely remodel their army, in hopes that it would be the difference needed to claim the total victory that they were searching for. Led by Thomas Fairfax, every man was issued a red uniform to avoid confusion on the battlefield. They were professional, full-time soldiers that were available to be deployed wherever and whenever needed. In May 1645, the Royalist army captured Leicester, forcing Thomas Fairfax to march north to meet them in battle. Charles commanded just 9,000 men, compared to the 14,000-strong New Model army, as they came face to face on a foggy morning near Naseby. After a short artillery barrage, the men-at-arms clashed. Led by Prince Rupert, the nephew of King Charles, the Royalist cavalry on the right flank saw initial success, as did the outnumbered infantry, but the benefit of a disciplined and trained fighting force was quickly put on display. As Prince Rupert's cavalry chased their fleeing foes away from the battle, he was unaware that on the other side of the field, Oliver Cromwell was crushing his opposition. In a decisive moment of the battle, Cromwell was able to keep his cavalry disciplined and wheeled them around to attack the undefended Royalist infantry. By the time Rupert was able to rejoin the battle, it was too late. The Royalist army was completely destroyed, and King Charles was forced to flee, with 1,000 of his soldiers dead and 4,500 captured. The battle was the decisive victory that Parliament had been searching for. They went on to capture key Royalist strongholds, and within a year the First English Civil War had ended, with Parliament victorious. Charles was eventually caught, imprisoned, and in 1649 executed as a tyrant, traitor, murderer and public enemy.